Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next episode of the Schmoozin with Forouzan podcast. Very happy to be here today. It's a lovely sunny day in Southern California. And what's awesome about this podcast for me, and I think the listeners, is I get to speak with people who I find interesting. I get to speak to people who practice different areas of law with me or areas of law that overlap. And I've known Mr. Bradley I. Kramer for I don't know how long, but Brad always stuck out to me because he's not only a lawyer, he's also a doctor and a real doctor, an MD. So I thought it would be great to have him on the podcast, and he agreed to do so. And Brad, how are you today, sir?
I am great. Happy to be here, my friend. Happy to have some good thoughts and good conversations with you.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think this should be interesting. I'm especially interested in asking you about med school versus law school and things like that. A lot of lawyers will find that interesting.
I'm glad you're asking a question that no one has ever asked before.
Really? No one's ever asked that before?
I'd say I get asked that probably every third day, but I always have a good answer for it, and always changes a little bit. You know, as I grow, the story gets a little bit more colorful. By the time I turn 80, you know, I will have landed on the moon before I went to med school.
Yeah, I understand. Well, look, if other people are asking you this question, it means I'm I'm on the right path if that's what people are interested in.
That's
right.
right.
Let's get into it. So I shy away from the question of tell me about your background, because people tell me about like their childhood and stuff. No one wants all that. But in your case, you do have a specifically interesting background. You went to both med school and law school. Why don't you tell me how that happened?
Sure. I'll take a 2-hour conversation and I'll condense it in about 30 seconds. I went to undergrad at the University of Michigan. I majored in biology there. My dad was a doctor, still is. He's one of those guys that he'll never stop practicing. I think he's 80 or 81 years old, still working. So, you know, that's that old school doctor mentality where all they want to do is take care of patients. And, you know, that's the kind of doctor that I would want personally, even in this day and age. So, you know, I knew medicine kind of as a kid growing up. And when I got out of undergrad, I figured the natural move was just to go to med school. So I went. The first 2 years are purely academic in medical school. So you're studying biochemistry and genetics and pathology and learning about all the systems of the body, which I find to be extraordinarily interesting. And we'll get to this later in the show. But to understand how the human body works and how all the systems interact with each other and have to work correctly in order for this human being or that human being to exist it's a fascinating study. It really is. So the first 2 years were great. Then you get into the third year where you're in your clinical rotations in the hospital. That's where you're seeing people with cancer, heart attacks, you know, kids who are dying. And psychologically, you have to be in that game to win it. I mean, you really have to know that this is what you want to do. This is your life's work, because from an emotional perspective, it just weighs on you every day.
Yeah.
Anyway, I got to a point about 3 years in where I said, I just don't know if this is for me. So at that point, I figured, okay, I'm going to wind up taking another path. I wound up finishing med school, did not sign up to do a residency program because I just had no interest in a clinical practice, took the LSAT. Interesting part about that was my dad came home one day, totally randomly, and we lived in Chicago at that time. I was born and raised in Chicago. And he says, you know, a spot opened at UCLA for you to do a 1-year residency to get your medical license. And in order to do really anything in medicine, an MD doesn't get you anything. You need that license to practice, whether or not you're board certified. So I literally packed up 2 duffel bags after speaking with the program director, packed up 2 duffel bags, got on a plane, wound up sleeping in the call rooms at the VA Medical Center, because that was where my first rotation was, had no place to live. And from about 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. in the afternoon, because my shift started at 3 p.m., I went up and down the streets looking for a place to live while I was doing that first rotation. But I knew when I was doing that first rotation, or even before then, that this was a 1 year, one and done, and then I'm out of here. So then I went to law school, came out of law school, worked at a couple of bigger corporate firms, didn't like that, had a couple of other business endeavors, and then wound up in about 2008, 2009 saying, well, it looks like I got to get back into the law game. And that's when I started my firm. And then I've been doing what I'm doing right now, which is about 95% medical malpractice cases since about 2008, 2009.
Doctors ever give you a difficult time because
Yeah,
you're an MD?
all the time. I mean, it's funny because I will see and interact with doctors on a regular basis, whether it's my own doctor or, I have friends who are doctors, and oftentimes I can't tell them what I do.
Mm.
I'll give you an example. I went to vote the other day for the Los Angeles elections, and it was pouring rain, and I walked over to the election place from my office, and I asked around if anyone could give me a ride back to the office. The guy who wound up giving me a ride back was an OBGYN who knew the same people coincidentally that I knew. And when he asked me what I did, I wasn't going to tell the guy, well, I sue doctors for a living, right? So I had to tell him, I do some other stuff and I'm a lawyer. Yeah, that is a difficult part of what I do because I like doctors. I think doctors are good people. I think they genuinely go into medicine to help people. So suing them is not a feel-good career in that respect. There are a lot of doctors that screw up and, they cause serious injuries to clients, but I honestly think fundamentally they're a good group of people. So when I go out and tell people what I do, it's not the easiest thing to say.
Yeah, I don't think anyone looks at doctors and thinks there's some bastion of evil. Doctors do have a special place, I'd say, in society in terms of how people look at them. But of course, they're ultimately human and thus valuable. So
right.
Everything has its place.
That's what I say. Listen, we're all human beings. Everyone makes mistakes, whether you're an architect or a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor. That's why people have insurance. And yes. I think for anyone to say, whether they're in medicine or law or any other field, I'm never going to make a mistake that winds up hurting people, whether it's financially or in their physical body. I think that's unrealistic. And so that's kind of my philosophy on this is I'm not suing you because I want to hurt you. I'm suing you because you're a human being and you made a mistake.
Yeah, of course. Let me ask you this question. What I understand the law has changed recently, and there is more what seems to be options for consumers. Before the law changed, let's pretend the law hasn't changed for the purpose of this question. Why are doctors so terrified of lawyers? And let me follow up with that. Every doctor I speak to says, "Oh, you lawyers are ruining it for us." I'm thinking to myself, you guys have MICRA. You have one of the most you also have a professional negligence standard.
Sure.
You have one of the highest barriers to entry for a lawsuit. Why are they so freaked out about lawyers when it's so hard to sue doctors?
Yeah. There's a couple reasons, but what I'll point you to is the recent case I think it was New York against the Trump organization. Mm-hmm. And there was an article that I read on Yahoo which said that the entire case might hinge on the interpretation of the word or. Mm. Right? Was this an and or was it an or? And did the or modify the first word or the second word? And I think that's why doctors get scared, because lawyers have an ability to bend things, to bend words. It is a little bit harder to do in medicine because you have objective findings. Mm. Right. But pain, on the other hand, for example, is a very subjective item. Right. Or what complaints a patient may have said to a doctor when they first presented. Sometimes all of those complaints are not written down in the note, and sometimes they are, and maybe they're not written entirely accurately because doctors are scribbling furiously to try and get everything down and at the same time think about what the problem might be. And I think doctors are scared that lawyers have a way with words, and we're clever or can be clever and creative in creating a narrative and a story that when you look at it from an objective standpoint, they say, well, gosh, someone might actually find against me, even though I, doctor, didn't do anything wrong. And I think that scares people in general.
Well, okay, so let me follow up. You got to the next point that I was going to make. I agree with you. Lawyers are, as I've heard it put before, wizards of spin. A lawyer can take a look at facts and they can cook up something or another with it, etc. I understand that. I appreciate advocacy. Everyone's seen those memes online that show a photo from two different perspectives. And depending on what perspective you're looking at it, you see a completely different image. I understand that. But with that logic, literally every human being should be scared of lawyers, right? There's right.
Most people are, aren't they?
Fair. But there's just something I found with the doctors where once I tell them I'm a lawyer, the moans and groans start.
Right.
And it kind of it leads us into, I think, maybe the next question, which is what's the difference between med school and law school and lawyers and doctors. But is there something in particular that I'm missing? And also, most general people don't have the professional negligence protection that doctors have.
Sure.
So is it that the insurance is really expensive? What is it that gives rise to this moaning and groaning about lawyers amongst doctors?
I think a lot of it, to be honest, is ego.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I mean, everyone's got a little bit of an ego, but doctors go in and there's this sort of perception in the public that we're gods and we are healing and healers and healing people. And so when a lawyer comes in and says, you know, knock, knock, yeah, you're not so perfect as you think you were. You killed this person or you harmed this person. I think the initial stunned reaction of the doctor is, what do you mean? I'm a doctor. I'm here to help people. I didn't harm it. So there's sort of an automatic, visceral response to that affront from a lawyer. I think that's what, at least that's part of it. I see it regularly where doctors just will not consent to any settlement of any amount of money for some person that was injured. And some of the time it's merited and sometimes it's not. But I do understand your perspective when, you know, if you were to go talk to an engineer or an architect as a lawyer, there's not that visceral response. The college football playoffs are coming up shortly. And, you know, we have I went to Michigan for undergrad and Ohio State is also in the playoffs. And the closest I can analogize that visceral reaction is my reaction to Ohio State, right? When I see that logo, it just disgusts me, right? And there's no real basis for it. Place them in football. We played them for 120 years or whatever it is. But it's a visceral reaction. I can't stand seeing that logo. And I think that's kind of the same thing that doctors have with lawyers.
It's interesting. I mean, your point is satisfying to me in the sense that I assume there was a bit of a professional competitiveness maybe that I get. I mean, I always like to, you know, I always jab the doctors or try to make fun, be like, what sneakers are you wearing today? Oh, I'm sure those are comfortable. Versus my loafers that I wear to court or whatever it is. I get it. And when you're a doctor, I think there's something to be said. Med school is, correct me if I'm wrong, much longer than law school. And I think that sort of gives them, and you, frankly, a bit of a higher platform on the professional food chain. So I wonder if this is just a little bit of ribbing between professionals. And if it is, great, because we're about to participate in exactly that. Let's talk about med school versus law school. What was the difference?
You know, that is a question that I don't get asked often, but here's what I can say. For me, med school was a far more academic experience. You have to read the books. You have to know the science. You have to know how the body systems interact. You cannot wing it. You cannot go to a lecture and by osmosis pick up everything that you need to know about how the body works and how these systems interact and how medications affect systems and how all the biochemical reactions take place. Contrasted with law school, where after the first semester, I never bought another book the entire time I was at law school. There's a lot of more legal leaps that you make in law school, where you take a small underlying foundational premise and you then apply that to all types of different facts or situations, as opposed to in medicine, where I think the foundation of your knowledge is so much broader and has to cover such a larger range of interacting systems that it makes it a lot more complex. Med school is longer by a year, at least currently. Then law school, it's 4 years as opposed to 3 years. But then again, after med school, you can't do anything unless you do a residency, an internship
Mm.
and residency. So all in, you're looking at anywhere between post med school, you're looking at between 1 and 7 years extra. And law school, you're looking at 3 years. And then if you want to go out and hang your own shingle, well,
Yeah.
by all means, go do it. I will tell you this, though. I took 3 sets of board exams in medical school and during my internship year. The hardest exam I ever took in my entire life was the California bar exam.
Interesting. What
Because
what about the exam? What about the bar exam superseded the med exams?
you mean what made it more difficult?
Yes.
Well, that was when it was 3 days, and it was just an absolute. I don't even know what the word is. Just trying to think of the word. Just 3 days of just absolute hell. Right, sleeping in a hotel for 2 nights and stressing the entire time what the questions are going to be, what the topic is going to be. It was terrible, and I studied like hell for that exam. I mean, that I don't drink coffee. That was the one experience for which I was drinking coffee every night for. I mean, I'm guessing it was months. 2 or 3 months. I think we studied for that.
Yeah, yeah. I remember waking up in my hotel room at 5 a.m. and the first thing I did is I rolled over and I had it left for me the previous night, my outline.
Right.
I just pulled it in bed. I'm like, review the outline, review the outline. So by the time you get to the exam at 8 o'clock, you're refreshed.
Right. And it has nothing to do with what we do today.
Nothing whatsoever. Yeah. So actually, good point, because it segues to my next point. You point out that lawyers take law school, hang their shingle, good to go. And you also point out that med school seems to be more academic. It seems to be more you had to read everything, etc. What does that say to you about law school in conjunction with the notion that, the Cal Bar and maybe law school actually doesn't prepare someone to practice law?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, years ago, I called Stanford, which is where I went to law school, and I said, this is a joke. I got out of law school, one of the most prestigious law schools in the US, maybe the entire world.
Yeah.
And I didn't know the first thing about how to actually litigate a claim.
Yeah.
Right? Well, what's a demur? How do you draft a demur? Or how do you respond to discovery? What objections do you throw out there? I had no idea. What's a mediation? And I said, this is criminal that you don't teach law students how to be a litigator. I said, let me come up there and teach a class on trial advocacy or civil litigation, not just reading through case law and knowing what the cases say, but what do you actually do? When I first came out of law school and I started working at the first firm I was working at, I had no idea what to do at a hearing. So the first 2 times that I went to a courthouse to attend a hearing, I had to have a senior lawyer come with me because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what table to stand at, how to address the judge, or what to say to him. And to me, those are skills that absolutely need to be taught by law schools.
Yeah.
I do think that law schools in the past, say, 15 years have sort of come to that realization, and I do think they're doing a better job. I'm not involved enough with my law school to say with any certainty whether they're legitimately doing a better job preparing lawyers to be lawyers. But it's like the question that you asked me presupposes, which is, law school is not really a good indicator of who's going to be a good lawyer. I think med school is probably a little bit better than that, probably because the last 2 years of med school are clinical rotations, and they involve seeing patients, taking care of patients, making medical conclusions, whereas law school is just 3 years of pure academics. So you don't know what it's like to go to a courtroom.
Yeah. And by the way, I love that you brought up that you took the 3-day bar. So did I.
Yeah.
We got to figure out where it is in the state bar numbers. Like, what's the cutoff that they switch to the 2-day bar? And then we can make fun of everyone with a lesser bar number than ours.
We're dinosaurs. We're dinosaurs. I mean, that was a slog. I think that's the word I was looking for previously. I mean, that was hell on earth for 3 days.
Yeah, that was pretty intense. You know what's funny about that? I think that was the smartest I've ever been my whole life. I remember I was sharp.
Yeah.
Sharp as heck. Well caffeinated. I was eating all the foods that are allegedly good for the brain, like fat foods, fats, sugars, things of that nature from healthy sources. I remember I was talking to a buddy of mine who's always been one of the most intelligent people I knew. I was like, for the first time ever, he doesn't seem that much sharper than me. And of course, after you stop studying every day for the bar and all that stuff, it wanes a bit. But
Yeah.
I do think that's the smartest I've ever been. But let's talk about law students and med students. Why? Because I remember one day when I went to a law school event, everyone was red-faced, wasted. And now, mind you, I went to college. I went to undergrad at USC. I lived on campus. I partied around campus. I went to fraternities. I saw how college students drink, and they drink. It did not hold a candle to how I saw law students drink. And frankly, lawyers are now good drinkers as well. They're such a good drinker. But so what's the difference between a law student and a med student?
Well, I mean, I'll just ask you the question. Would you rather party with a doctor or party with a lawyer?
Lawyer. Oh, no questions asked.
No question.
Yeah, that's an obvious one.
But you wouldn't want a lawyer to be cutting you out your insides if you had some problem, with your body. So doctors are a pretty serious bunch. I mean, they can let loose. I mean, listen, my dad, like I said, was a cardiologist, still is a cardiologist. He's 80 years old. He's a pretty serious guy. But that's the kind of person that I want to be my doctor. In med school, there were some guys that kind of let loose and were a little looser around the edges as opposed to the higher strung individuals. And I went to Stanford for law school where you don't have the loosest group of people there. So to me, there wasn't this stark difference between the two environments. But yeah, I would agree with you wholeheartedly that if I'm going to pick two people to hang out and have a couple beers with, most of the time it's going to be a lawyer as opposed to a doctor.
And was that represented in, because we kind of conflated both the law student and the doctor and the med student and lawyer. Is that represented overall in your experience as a med student and a doctor? I noticed that people were just generally more serious than a law student and a lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Again, it's just, I think law school selects for a different personality type than med school does. Med school tends to attract, in my experience, in my opinion, what I've seen over the years, a more intellectual, serious, by the book type of person. Law schools and certainly the plaintiff's bar. I mean, it's a bunch of guys who are very creative, entrepreneurial, can put spins on something, can find various ways around a litigation to make the case more palatable to the defense. So just a more creative, is it left brain or right brain? Whatever brain it is. I think it's right brain, but I'm not sure. Doctors just tend to be more heady, more intellectual. I will tell you this, though. Prior to me doing medical malpractice law, I worked at a firm that specialized in healthcare regulatory work. This was a firm, and they were exceptional at what they did. This is an area of law that is very dependent on statutory underpinnings and government regulations, very intellectual. And that group of people were more doctor-like in their approach to life, very, very serious people. For me, that didn't mesh well. And it didn't mesh well with me also working at the big white shoe law firms.
Yeah. So I know that the majority of people who listen to my podcast are lawyers, but I don't think very many of them do medical practice. I don't think very many of them do medical malpractice. So my question for you would be, what is the threshold for liability? What is the standard by which you can bring a med mal case?
So I think the real disconnect between the public and what we do is the public thinks that a bad outcome necessitates a finding that there was malpractice. Grandma went in, she was alive, walking, talking, and she came out dead. My husband went in and he had both legs and he came out with only one leg. That must be malpractice. It can't not be malpractice. And the disconnect there is that we need to prove that not only was there a bad outcome, but that someone did something unreasonable to have caused that outcome. Not that there wasn't a mistake, right? People think mistake equals malpractice, or bad outcome equals malpractice. The issue is, if someone made a mistake that no reasonable doctor would have made, then you get a breach of the standard of care, element 1 for a malpractice claim. The second component is that it has to actually cause the injury. So if you have a terrible outcome, if you have something that the doctor does, which is totally against the standard of care, no reasonable doctor would have done that, but the patient's injury is related to some other aspect of what's going on in their medical history, then you have a disconnect between the standard of care and causation, and they have to go together. So what I wind up finding in my practice is I have a lot of people that call me and are absolutely disappointed and more, that I say to them, I'm sorry, but this is a reasonable complication or a known complication of this surgery. Or your mom was 85 years old and she had high blood pressure and coronary artery disease and diabetes and all these other medical conditions. And that was what caused all of these things to happen. Well, no, my mom was healthy. Well, actually, I hate to bring this to your attention, but she wasn't as healthy as you thought she was, because she had all of these things, right? She had a she had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or emphysema from smoking for 40 years. Those things have an impact on basically everything.
Mm.
So that's the disconnect. And so you see a lot of people being disappointed and a lot of cases being turned away, not only by my firm, but by a lot of other firms for that reason. And then, of course, the other reason that these cases tend to be very expensive to litigate from the get-go.
I can understand that. You're going to need a lot of experts and things of that nature, I assume.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Okay, I understand that sounds like duty breach caused harm. It sounds like negligence the way you described it.
Right.
But correct me if I'm wrong. The duty breach portion of it, there is a higher standard. And if I remember from law school 10 years ago, it's not, professional negligence revolves around what a reasonably prudent professional in a similar community,
right,
or the same community or the same area would do.
Right.
That's multiple layers of specificity. Did I get that right?
More or less. I mean, it's not necessarily that I have to have a Southern California doctor testify against another Southern California doctor. But sure, if I had a case against, let's say, UCLA, and I hired an expert from some no-name town in, Arkansas, not to disparage Arkansas, but yeah, I mean, I think there could be a problem there. Certainly, and we're not talking about a medical center, like a university medical center in Arkansas, but a small little community town in backwoods city. That might cause some problems. So the experts that I tend to use tend to have university connections in some way, whether they're an associate professor or having had a prior professorship at some university or some academic involvement. But the other part of medical malpractice that's very different than your garden variety slip and fall or car accident or dog bite case is that at trial, the likelihood of me winning that case is less than 20%.
Mm.
Whereas in a car accident case, I'm pretty confident that I'm going to win 80 to 90% of those cases. Now, I might not recover a lot of money, right? I might only get $5,000 or $10,000 from a jury. But most of those cases, I can win liability. And in most cases in medical malpractice, I know from experience that I'm going to lose that case on liability 80+% of the time. And those aren't just my statistics. Those are across, whether it's Southern California or California in total. They're very difficult cases to win at trial. Jurors like doctors, as they should. I want jurors to like doctors, and getting them to move from we like doctors, we idolize doctors, to thinking to themselves, well, doctors can make errors too. That keeps people up at night. because then they think to themselves, well, what if I went into a hospital? Is a doctor going to make a mistake on me? And that scares people, and rightfully so. But that's the uphill battle that we have to face, running the gauntlet in these med mal cases.
I understand that. The standard that I brought up, which is the professional negligence standard, and I mentioned a doctor within the same community. Correct me if I'm wrong, I interpreted that, or what I remember from law school, it's you want a doctor from the same community so that you have people who are kind of on even playing fields.
Right.
You had mentioned, you can have some backwater doctor with no name, not a lot of prestige, and you can have some doctor who's a researcher at Stanford or Harvard or whatever it might be, and there's going to be a discrepancy there. My question is this baked into the law? In other words, I'm trying to remember if my memory from med school is right. Is statutory or case law involved in saying, hey, you should have similarly situated doctors, or is that just hiring good experts?
I think it's just hiring good experts. There's no statutory requirement that the expert be from, for example, the Southern California area. But remember, I look at medical malpractice cases from the perspective from the outset of, can I win this case at trial? And if they put up as you were referring to, a research professor at Stanford, and I put up some, podunk doctor who's practiced for 3 years in a backwater community with no academic experience whatsoever, a jury is not going to like that. And already I'm behind the 8 ball just from the time I get to the starting gate on a med mal case. So again, it's not really statutory mandated, but to put together a successful case, you really do need to have people that have good credentials that can withstand scrutiny from someone else who I know they are going to have academic credentials.
Okay, fair enough. I'm glad my memory from law school isn't completely faded away.
If you forget the rule against perpetuities, there's always books that you can refer to for that one.
I just think I never memorized it.
That was smart. You took a risk that they weren't going to ask that question on the bar exam.
It wasn't. I at a certain point, I realized this is not worth the time that I'm putting into it. And it's funny because I keep seeing on all the Instagram meme accounts that I follow, the rules against perpetuities constantly come up.
Yes.
Like there's a photo of a guy at a cashier, and the cashier says, "Is there anything else you would like?" And the guy says, "Could you please explain the rule of perpetuities to me?" It's a constant thing. It's funny. I would love to get a property professor on here, or even a dean of a law school, and just ask them and show them the memes and be like, what's going on with this rule?
Well, the rule against perpetuities has become the McDonald's coffee case of law school.
Yes, that is true. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about MedMal recently. Looks like there have been some significant developments.
Sure.
Could you tell us about those?
Yeah. So first, shout out to Nick Rowley, who one of the greatest trial lawyers that we have in California, for sure, maybe the entire United States. And, he bankrolled this proposition basically single-handedly.
Wow.
And I know he worked together with Consumer Watchdog and some others and some legislators up in Sacramento, but the new legislation that begins January 1, 2023 does not happen without his support. Financially, socially, politically, doesn't happen. So big shout out to him. As far as the changes are concerned, I mean, you want to talk about a law that was due to be changed. That was a law, the original micro law was put in place in 1975. So we're looking at almost 50 years of a law that has never changed, never been even adjusted for inflation. I mean, that's just preposterous. So the new law does put into place some new ceilings or caps on pain and suffering damages for med mal cases, which is great. The only concern that I have about the new law is that, I don't know how to phrase this lightly or politically correct, but because there's more money that's going to be in these cases, there may be an influx of lawyers who smell that and say, well, maybe I should be a med mal lawyer now. And I just, I have to be a little bit concerned because I know the amount of cases that I intake versus the amount of cases that I actually retain. and it is an extraordinarily small amount of cases. The problem with taking too many cases that are not good cases is twofold. Number one, it's not good for the attorney because they're going to wind up spending a lot of money on cases that wind up going nowhere. And I can tell you stories from here until the doomsday about attorneys that call me mid-case saying, I need some help now on this med mal case. And I look at the case very briefly and I say, why did you take this case in the first place? I would have never taken this case. But the more important aspect of non-med mal lawyers now potentially starting to take med mal cases is they're going to give a false sense of hope to individuals that don't have a case, that wind up being told, yes, you do have a case, and then wind up not recovering any money. And not only does that lead them on a long cascade of events, depositions, reliving the story to get to a point ultimately where there's no settlement that's made. But it's hard on all the parties. It's hard on the doctors who get sued. It's hard on the patient, the plaintiffs or the patients who wind up having to go through this litigation. And I'm not saying I'm not saying that increased access to attorneys is a bad thing. It's not. It is a good thing that more plaintiffs will have more options potentially to have lawyers take their case. But again, what I'll tell you is based upon the number of intakes that I take and the cases that I actually retain, there aren't that many great med mal cases. There's a lot of people that get injured from healthcare. But as far as a provable med mal case, I run a small firm and I am not overrun or overwhelmed by the number of good cases that come into my office. I don't turn away good cases because I just can't handle them because my schedule is so full. If there's a good case, I will take it. So again, I'm a little bit concerned about how that's going to play out. The other thing is in a PI case, sometimes those cases can be handled a little bit at arm's length a little bit so that they don't need personal attention on a regular basis. Med mal is a little bit different. The lawyers who defend med mal cases are very good. They're very smart. They know the medicine, as opposed to a State Farm lawyer who, with a car accident case, and I'm sure you've experienced this, they're sleeping at the wheel. I don't see defense attorneys sleeping at the wheel on med mal cases, probably because they're a smarter group. And secondly, they're representing doctors who, if they fall asleep at the wheel, a doctor's going to be on top of that. And I don't know if you want to comment, or talk about the opposite that you might see in a car accident or slip and fall case, but I know that to be the case through personal experience, that sometimes defense lawyers are asleep at the wheel on those types of cases. So that's also a very different situation.
Yeah, I will endorse everything you said here in the sense that I do personal injury, I do abuse, which is elder abuse and child abuse, and I do employment. And it's very clear to me that there's a difference in the quality of the defense attorney, or quality might not be the right word. How about aggressiveness?
Yeah, or attentiveness.
Yes. And knowledge of the law, knowledge of the case, time spent. In the arena of employment, I have found the defense attorneys to be the most aggressive and the most sophisticated. And it's a clear night and day difference to me. So and by the way, in personal injury, there is virtually no barrier to entry in a plaintiff's attorney. You snap your finger, you're a PI attorney.
Right.
And I have seen what that can do. And I have my hesitations about that. I have my hesitations because my office, or I should say, I started law working for corporations. I worked for a firm that had a bunch of Ivy League guys. They wanted me on there as more of we need to add some color to our arguments. We want you on there to help with the theatrics and that type of stuff. And so I grew up in a sense in a corporate litigation environment. And I got that especially when it comes to motion work and familiarity with it, I got acclimated there. I then got training from an insurance defense attorney who literally would tell me about the other law firms, plaintiff PI firms. And they intimately got involved with my practice to the point where they were like a quasi partner.
Mhm.
And they were kind enough to bestow upon me all this information, review my discovery, review the opposing counsels, this and that. But what was most eye-opening was consistently pointing out to me the low quality of work product that comes forth from personal injury attorneys, especially in Southern California,
Yeah.
regardless of the size of their law firm.
Yeah.
Sometimes the bigger the law firm, the less the quality of litigation, according to this individual. And they would show me, how things work behind the curtain. So if you're going to say to me, there's going to be a bunch more lower quality med mal attorneys out there as a result of that, trust me, I know I'm already pretty acquainted with that. Now, there's the flip side of the coin, which is okay. So you have a bunch less, you might have less quality, but the increase in quantity will increase the availability of justice. And I could see that as being true. I don't take that away from anyone. I certainly don't want to deprive anyone of access to justice. I do wonder, however, if those sentiments hit the nail on the head when it comes to certain types of practices, or maybe certain types of practices in certain areas. For example, we have the stuff at the state bar. They want to let non-lawyers practice law, increasing access to justice. I had an interview with Brian Kabatek, and we had the same exact conversation. There, in my opinion, is no lack of access to justice when it comes to PI. I
Yes.
mean, drive anywhere in the state of California, you'll see billboards. I bet you they've already started building billboards on Mars and the moon. Auto accident. It's superfluous. It's obviously a saturated environment. So I wonder, when you say increase access to justice, that sounds good. I'm generally for that. However, when you apply it to certain arenas of the law, I think it gets a little bit more complicated. So just a side note of my own. So I wanted to, and you've been by the way, very generous with your time today. I appreciate that. Let me
Sure.
ask you, you have your own podcast, or is it coming out?
It's coming out. I have to set up the studio for it. But it is originally it was going to be called Dr. Brad's Hospital Horrors. Um, and kind of a little bit tongue in cheek, but also a little bit serious. There are reports that I get on I think it's a bi-weekly basis about all the doctors that have been whose licenses have been revoked. And some of them are for very unfortunate circumstances, and some of them are for truly egregious circumstances, such as sex with patients in their office, all kinds of inappropriate things that happen. And so, not necessarily taking personal or making personal attacks at any individual, any named individual. I find some of those stories to be fascinating. And again, the decision making of some individuals, I just find to be mind boggling, especially doctors who, again, as we said earlier in the program, are a pretty intellectual bunch. I mean, a lot of schooling, a lot of training. And then to ruin that by having, videotaping sex with a patient in your operating chair. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's madness. But yet it exists. It exists, and so those are the types of stories that I feel like need a voice to explain to the public. Again, not to belittle or besmirch the medical profession, but there are always characters in any profession, and I find some of it to be just absolutely what's the word, worthwhile public. I'm not sure what the word is. Newsworthy that I find interesting and entertaining, and also to have a lesson built into that type of conduct as well. So I don't know what it's going to be called yet. We don't have a final name, but that should be out, I'm guessing, sometime in 2023. And I'd love to have you on that as well.
I would love to be on. I also, and I appreciate the invitation. I am so curious. There's got to be a segment of the audience who's going to listen to this, because some of these are going to be gruesome, right? Some of these are going to be gnarly.
Sure. Yes.
And I just know there's people on the internet who love to get into that stuff. Be curious what a subsegment of your audience is who listen to that. I'm not going to lie. Even I have a curiosity. Like, I don't want to be morbid. I don't want to be gruesome, but I am kind of curious look, I was one time scheduled for a hemilaminectomy. Didn't happen. and it probably shouldn't have happened. Thank goodness I got a second and a third opinion. That's a whole other conversation on its own. But yeah, I know what's involved in that surgery. I get it. They're done every day. They're arguably routine. It terrifies me. You got your spinal cord right there and then, and they're moving bones. They're cutting bones out. They got,
Right.
I guess it's laparoscopic now, but it doesn't make me any less concerned. I think it's a worthwhile thing. I think people should know if and when mistakes are made and what kind of mistakes are made. Generally speaking, I think a better educated public is a better thing. I mean, certainly there'll be that one person who watches one of your podcasts and then thinks every doctor is like an evil, maniacal guy who goes home and kills baby dolphins. But I think generally speaking, it's a worthwhile thing. So I would very much so look forward to listening in.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting show. The world likes to be titillated, but they also like to be informed, and I think it'll be a little bit of both. So it'll be interesting, but stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Well, I tell you what, we'll broadcast your podcast once you get it together. And I just wanted to thank you. If you can believe it, we've been going for an hour. Feels more like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I appreciate you taking time. I know you're a busy guy. I appreciate you taking the time today to come and speak with me and have my audience listen to what you have to say. For me, it's been very enlightening. I always like to give, who's on the podcast last word. If there's anything you have to say to the audience, or if you want to put your law firm on blast or anything, please have at it.
Yeah, there's just a couple of remarks I want to add. The first is that, me and you are both members of CALA, which is the Consumer Attorneys Association of Los Angeles. I think we do great things for the public. I think our goal really, whether it's my firm or your firm, is really to protect people that can't otherwise protect themselves. I think that a lot of what we do results in legitimate change within industries. If you look at the weed killer, that case, I forget the name of it.
Roundup.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a plaintiff's law firm that has effected real change that is going to affect Americans on a wide scale. So maybe what me or you do on a day-to-day basis doesn't have that kind of global or national impact, but every small thing that we do is done with the understanding that we're trying to make the world a safer and a better place, and to help people that either don't have the resources or the education to be able to fight the battles that we can fight for them. So I obviously appreciate what you do. I try and focus my practice on people that have suffered from medical errors. Again, with no ill will in my heart towards doctors, but everybody makes mistakes. Yeah. My law firm, just to point out my website, it's calldrbrad.com. And you can find my phone number. I have a couple, but the most convenient one is probably just 424-INJURED.
Oh, so good phone number.
Good phone. I have that website as well. But anyway, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm always here to share, or happy to share information with you or your listeners. And I think you appreciate what I do, and I likewise very much appreciate what you do. And I thank you for inviting me on this podcast.
I'm flattered. We should have you come back on. I know saying a year or two is a long time from now. You can come by sooner if you'd like, but we should have you come on. The reason I say a year or two is to kind of let these changes in the law sink in.
Yeah.
And then have that conversation again and see how things changed.
That'd be great. I'd be honored to be a guest of yours again. This was a real treat for me on a Friday afternoon.
You're a gentleman. Thank you so much for your time.